Afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Doug Soltesz, and today we are going to be going over Power User commands for Amazon's S3 CLI. We're going to be focusing on the AWS CLI, and this is going to be a live demo. We're going to be in an environment, and so without further ado, let's get through a couple of quick housekeeping items. The first one is, what are we going to be doing today? Well, we're going to be looking at the AWS CLI. We're going to be going over some use cases, and then we're going to jump straight into the demo. In the demo, I'm going to teach you how to install this. I'm going to be installing in Linux, but we can install it for Mac and Windows as well. We're going to configure it. We're going to configure it against Amazon's AWS S3. Now I'm going to show you how to configure it for an on-prem S3 solution like Cloudian HyperStore, and then we're going to demo a bunch of commands. So before we get into this, the first housekeeping item is if you look at your GoToWebinar panel, there is a little tab called Handouts. There's 5 of them in there, and the most important one is this AWS CLI guide. In it, you're going to find a complete guide of how to install Amazon AWS CLI for Windows, Mac OS, Linux. I outline Oracle Linux, RHEL, CentOS, Ubuntu, but of course it'll work with Debian. You could probably even, whatever your favorite flavor is, Mint, it doesn't matter. It's got configuration guides. It's got shortcuts for aliasing commands. And then, of course, it's got what you're seeing right here, the CLI cheat sheet, so that for basic commands, you can just reference this and be on your way. So why the AWS CLI? There are multiple CLIs out there that work with S3. In fact, probably the most famous one is S3 Command or S3 CMD. But the reason that we are highlighting and working with AWS CLI is that it's definitely the most actively maintained. If you look at my screenshot on the right there of GitHub, you can see that there have been 254 releases. It's updated constantly. It works with all of the AWS services. So I've only named 3 of them here, but if you actually go to the project page, it works with at least 50 Amazon services. And when you look at something like S3 Command, all it works with is S3. It hasn't been maintained as much over the past 2 years. And so you're going to get more features, more functionality, more cross-platform functionality out of this tool. And let's talk about some of those basic features that we'll be going over today. You're going to be able to create and delete buckets. You're going to be able to copy or move objects into those buckets from your file system or vice versa. This one's really important. The parallel multi-part uploads. This is a key differentiator between the AWS CLI client and other ones out there. You're able to do 2 different things. The first one is if you have a folder full of small files, it's going to take them and move them in parallel. That's going to be much faster than moving one file at a time, because when we think about cloud storage, we know that it's high latency. You're talking to the internet, the Amazon cloud, but we also know that it's capable of a lot of throughput. And in order to get that throughput, unlike when you're in Windows and you try to copy a directory, we need to start moving these files in parallel. Now, if I have a really big file, like a movie file, what it'll do is it'll actually chunk that file up, and it'll move all of those pieces in parallel. By default, that's 10, but later on we'll have a more advanced session where we talk about how to up that limit. And then, of course, we can sync data. And sync, think about rsync. So the difference between sync and copy is that copy copies your data up to the cloud or vice versa. Sync copies only files that do not exist. It does a compare, and it checks to see either the file does not exist or it's been updated. A very handy feature that, again, is built into the AWS CLI. We're not going to get into advanced features today. We can save that for another webinar because we only have 30 minutes, but those would include things like encryption, include, exclude clauses, piping data, information lifecycle management. There's just so much more we could elaborate on. So let's go over a couple of quick use cases. I've used this before to script backup, so I had a watch folder, or I guess you could call it a watch bucket in this case, and I had my SQL Server doing its own SQL Server backup to a folder, and previously I was copying that to a SAN or a NAS. Now you can use this command to have that sync up to the cloud. Likewise, if you have genomics, and we'll be demoing that, something like an Illumina sequencer that's sequencing genomes, and you have hundreds of thousands or millions of small files, again, we highlighted that one of the key features here is the ability to move those in parallel. We'll be able to show that. I talked a little bit about really large files, why this command is better than other ones in the market, and even against just a standard, sys or NFS share. When you copy a big file with sys or NFS, it starts at the start and it just goes straight on through to the end, with the ability to parallel chunk your data and do rezooms. Obviously, this is a much more effective tool. And then likewise, and this might be a little advanced, but if you have video surveillance or CCTV equipment that is dropping to a folder or creating files, you could sync those up to the cloud. A little bit more advanced would be to take that feed and pipe it straight up to the cloud. But again, that's something we can get into another day. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the demo. We're going to be demoing installation, configuration, and a number of commands. So, clean up my screen. I'm starting off with Ubuntu. I'm on the trusty release 14.04. Now, of course, this will work with all the way back to 12.04. I've tested it, and of course, if you're running Xenial 16.04, this works just the same. And so the first thing you need to do is you need to have Python installed. Well, the good news is Python's already installed for 99% of the Linux distributions out there. Maybe not Alpine, but very easy to set up. The next thing you need to do is install pip. And pip you can install with just app install pip, or it's actually Python. And you're going to see it's already installed in this machine. Ubuntu already packages pip, but if you were using Oracle, CentOS, or RHEL, a minimal edition, you're not going to get pip. Again, if you look in the configuration guide, we have the RPM you need. What you're going to actually be doing is adding in the extra packages for Enterprise Linux, and then it's just proceeding as normal, doing the app install Python pip. So since I already have pip installed, the easiest way to install AWS CLI is now to use pip as my manager, and I'm going to do pip install AWS CLI. And the great thing about this is going to be common across all your platforms. So whether you're using Windows, Mac, or Linux, all we need to do is install pip, and then pip is going to be your package manager. It's going to be able to keep AWS up to date, and it's going to be common across everything. And so it's as simple as that. I've installed AWS CLI, and so let me just clear the screen. So now that I've done the installation, and we'll check on after this Windows and some other installers, but I need to configure it. And so what I'm going to run is this command here, AWS configure. And so the first thing it asks me for is, what is my AWS access key? And so if I go into my AWS web GUI, and I go over and I get my security credentials, I'm going to see an access key. So in my case, I've got this one right here. It's going to look like a large numeric number, and I'm just going to cut and paste that in because there's no way I'd be able to type that in. And then the next thing it's asking me for is my secret key. This is my signing key. So I've got that right here. The third question it's asking me is, what is my default region? So I'm broadcasting to you outside of the Bay Area, and so I am using US West 2. This is something that you'd be able to get easily from your Amazon session. In fact, I've got that open right over here, and you can see that right here in my AWS console, I can see that my region is US West 2. So I'm going to just go ahead and type that in, US West 2. And because I'm only using this for S3, I don't have to worry about my default output format. That would be more something you'd use if you're using this with ECS and whatnot. So I'm going to leave this as none. It won't hurt it at all if you type in JSON or you want one of the other formats. And so configuring it to work with the AWS cloud is as simple as that. And now we can actually start using the command. Now, I do have to do one other step, and the reason I have to do one other step is for anybody that's cut and pasting my screen, these are not my real Amazon credentials, so I do need to copy my real ones. So why don't we just look real quick. What has this done? If I look, I do an ls-a, you can see that I have this hidden directory now called AWS. And if I look in that directory, I'm going to see two files. I'm going to see a config file, and it's got my default region, and then I'm also going to have a credential file, and it's got my credentials. So all I'm going to do is, because these are fake credentials, I actually have a real credential file. And I'm just saying copy that over top of the fake one, and then we can start using these commands. All right. So now that I've got my real credentials in there, I should be able to do a command like this, AWS S3 LS. And now I can list my buckets. Now as you can see, I've got a bucket right here called Cloudian Demo Data. And if I log into my AWS, I can see that I've got the exact same bucket as well. In fact, I should be able to create a bucket. So I can do AWS S3 MB for make bucket. And again, all bucket names need to be global. So we're going to have to find one that is not in use. And so I'm hoping that if I use today's date, so 10/19/2016, Cloudian demo, that's not taken. Whoop. One other quick note. When using this, you do have to name everything S3://. And so with that, I've created a new bucket. If I go back and I refresh my console, I can see that I have that new bucket as well. So now let's see, how do we connect this to an on-prem S3 source? Because it's going to be the same commands, but for some of the demos I want to give later, I don't want to be maxing out my internet connection, because otherwise this webinar is going to run really slowly. So now what I want to do is I want to do my AWS configure again, and I could swap out my current credentials with my credentials for running on-prem, but I don't want to do that. I want to have two sets of credentials in the system, one for when I'm using the true Amazon cloud and one for when I'm using my on-prem storage. And the way to do that is I do -- profile, and I'm going to call this one Cloudian. And it's going to ask me the same questions. What is my access key? What is my secret key? And I've actually got my Cloudian interface open right here. I'm open to credentials. I can grab my key. I can grab my secret key. It's probably easier if I cut and paste from my file. And then when it asks for region, I'm going to actually tell it that I'm using US East 1. The reason that I'm doing this is that it makes compatibility really nice. And then again, I don't need an output format. And so now I'm set up, and I have two sets of credentials in the system. I have my Amazon credentials, and so anytime I type AWS space S3, I'm going to be able to use those. And anytime I specify the profile Cloudian, I'll be able to use my Cloudian on-prem profile. And so in order to do that, the command's going to look a little bit different. So normally I would type AWS S3, but this time I need to add in -- profile equals Cloudian. And then I also need to give it my endpoint. So normally it would go straight to the Amazon cloud, but I've got my own internal servers here. And so I need to give it the FQDN or the IP address of my on-prem system. So I'm going to do endpoint-URL equals HTTP S3 region 1.cloudian.local. And now I can do my command. So I can tell it S3 and I want a list. And I can see that I have one bucket. Now that's a little cumbersome to type that command in every time. Now obviously if you're working with life sciences, you have a LIMS system, or it's not a big deal to script it. But what I want to do is I want to make this easier to use. I'm going to make this easy to use whether I'm on Linux, Windows, or Mac. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to alias this command. And it's actually really simple to do. So in Linux, I have this file called bash.rc. And so I'm just going to edit it real quick. You can use any editor that you want. I happen to be a VI guy. And when I scroll down in my window, I'm going to find some other aliases. And so here's some other aliases that I already have in the system. And so I'm going to insert a new one. And so just to save time, I'm going to cut and paste, but I'll explain what the command does. So I'm aliasing the command HyperStore. Now, whenever I type the command HyperStore, it's going to type the following for me virtually. AWS, profile equals Cloudian, the endpoint, and even the command S3. It's going to save me an awful lot of typing. And so now I can save that file, and I can either log out and log back in, or I can just reload that file by doing source -rc. And now, watch what I can do. Instead of typing this long command up here, I can type in HyperStore. In fact, I can even hit Tab and use autocomplete, and now ls. And now I can list that same bucket. In fact, I can do HyperStore, MB for make bucket. Again, whenever I'm working with S3, I've got to type in S3//. And then I can do Illumina, because the next thing we'll do is we'll work with some genomics files. And so I can see that I've now created a bucket, and I can list that bucket. Now, to prove to you that this works in other systems, I can switch over to an Oracle Linux 7 system, and I've set it up the exact same way, and I can do HyperStore ls, and I can see I have Illumina. I can also do this with a CentOS 6 system, and I can do HyperStore ls. I've set up my Mac the same way. Now, with Mac, it's a little bit different. And again, this is all in the guide that we've made available for you to download. I can show you that there's actually a slightly different file. It's called bash profile, and I've put the same command in there, alias the command HyperStore, and it's going to fill the following in. So if I type HyperStore ls, again, I've got my two buckets. And last but not least, I want to make sure that if anybody is a Windows user, they know that this is perfectly compatible with Windows. Again, the command, it's slightly different. You have to use what's called DOS key to create an alias in Windows. But again, this is all in the manual. So I can type in HyperStore ls. I can see my buckets. In fact, I can do, again, MB for make bucket, S3://. Let's call this one movies. And I created a new bucket called movies. Now, to save everybody's eyes, let's go back to one of my systems that's already set up. So again, if I want to work with the actual Amazon cloud, I can do Amazon S3 ls. I've got my buckets. In fact, if I want to copy a file up, so I believe I've got a pretty small file here. I've got, under big files, I have a file called 2 megs. So what I want to do now is copy a file from my file system up to the Amazon cloud. So I'm going to do AWS S3, and then it's really simple, CP for copy. And then what file do I want to copy? Well, I want big files, and I want my 2 MB file, because again, my internet pipe is limited on my laptop right now for this demo. And where am I going to copy that? Well, we created these folders up in the cloud. So we're going to do S3:// Cloudian demo data. And you can see that I just copied that 2 meg file up to the cloud. And now if I once again check my Amazon system, and I go into Cloudian demo data, and I hit refresh here, I should now have one object. There we go, the 2 megabyte file. Now, we can do the same thing locally, and we can do that with much bigger files. So I don't want to copy this big movie file right now to Amazon's cloud because of my limited internet pipe. But I do want to demonstrate to you how easy it is to take a large file. And so if we do ll-h, we can see that that's a 350 meg file. I want to copy that to my on-prem object store. And I want it to be just as easy as if you were sitting here and you had a mounted file system, CIFS, NFS, that you were copying to. So I'm going to use my shortcut, my alias called HyperStore. I'm going to copy Big Buck Bunny, which is a free MP4 that you can download. And I'm going to copy that to the bucket we created called movies. I believe we created it called movies. There we go. And what's happening now is, even though you see it streaming, I have 10 simultaneous streams moving that file up to the cloud. So now if I want to list what's in an actual bucket, I can do, again, my alias HyperStore, list S3://movies, and it's going to show me that I have one object in that folder. Now, I can do other neat things as well. So let's rerun that command. I can copy that up, and when I copy it up, I can rename it. So I can call it new movie.mp4. And after it copies up, we'll list the container or the bucket again. And what we're going to see is that now I have two files. They're both the same size, but I was able to change the object's name. I'm also able to create virtual subdirectories. And so if once again I was going to copy that file up, but this time I wanted it to be in a virtual subdirectory called Doug, simply need to append that to the object's name, and I'm able to copy it up once again. And now what's interesting is when I list it, I see this thing called pre. Pre means prefix, because I don't actually have a subdirectory. What Amazon's doing for me is it's creating a virtual subdirectory. And so I have got this one called Doug. If I want to see what's in Doug, I can do /Doug/ and I can see that I have new movie in there. So it's very familiar. It's very much like using any normal Linux file system. And again, the same commands are going to work whether I'm in Mac, Windows, or any normal Linux distribution. So now let's do a couple of, a little bit more complicated things. The first one is, if I'm looking at my file system here, we've shown you how to move a big file, a movie file. But what if I wanted to copy an entire directory full of files? So if I once again do my HyperStore ls, I've got a bucket here called bucket1, and so I can do HyperStore copy, and I want to copy big files, and I want to copy everything in there to S3 bucket1. And the way that I'm going to copy everything in there is I'm going to use this, recursive, as long as I spell it right. And recursive means that it's going to iterate through big files and copy everything over. And again, and that was extremely quick because I'm using a gigabit line on-prem, I've got a bunch of 20 and 2 meg files that have been moved up there. And if I now look at what is in bucket 1, I can see all of these files that I've copied up to the cloud. Now, I could have given them each a prefix by putting a / there. And I just want to elaborate how easy this tool is to use and how I don't have to mount a file system. This will work if I'm running on my Linux or Windows or Mac laptop, whether I'm in the office or I go home, because this is all moving over HTTP or HTTPS. So there's no worrying about trying to mount a file system over the internet, which isn't something you can do. I have access to all my files. And then I can even do neat things like, if I'm running Windows, I can use a product like Cloudberry Explorer. I can do a refresh, and if I look in bucket 1, I can see all the same files. I could have also used the Cloudian web GUI to see this, or if I was moving these to Amazon, I could use Cloudberry against Amazon, or I could use the Amazon GUI that we just saw a minute ago. So now let's do something a little bit more complicated. Let's, instead of copy files, let's actually sync them. And syncing is really important when you have a data set that's constantly changing or evolving. And so the favorite data set I have for that is Illumina sequencer files. And so if I just look real quick, I've got this directory here called Illumina. If I do a find Illumina and pipe that to word count, you can see I have 162,000 files in this directory. And so what I want to do is I want to sync them up to the cloud. You can imagine I have my sequencer, it's doing an experiment run, and it's constantly spitting out new files. And so what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to use my alias HyperStore, and this time I'm going to use the command sync. And what sync is going to do is it's going to copy these because, again, they don't currently exist. But what we're going to do is interrupt the copy, and we're going to resume it, and it's going to pick up where it left off. But we could also make it pick up where it left off and take any changed files along the way. So I'm going to sync Illumina, and I'm going to sync it to that bucket we created earlier called Illumina. Now, one quick note is that when we're working with a normal file system, capital letters are okay. When we're working with buckets in the S3 cloud, capital letters are not okay. So we need to be DNS compliant, and so we need to make sure that these are all lowercase. All right, so we've got our sync running. You can see that it's got, it's synced up 1,000 files. Again, we have 100,000 plus files to go. The great thing about this is it's moving them concurrently. It's moving 10 at a time, and so much faster than a normal, sync or rsync or file system command. Again, in a more advanced session, we can talk about how to expand that pipe. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cancel this real quick. And we can see that, in uploading, I'm in experiment, 23, or let's just call it 5529, and I'm on lane 1. I made it up to cell 158. And so if I was to rerun that command, we wouldn't want it starting from the beginning. We want it to pick up where it left off. And so what this command is actually going to do is it's going to look at the date modified and the file size of all these files in my system. It's going to do a compare to them in Amazon. As long as they have not changed, it's going to pick up where it left off. If any file has been changed, it's going to resync that file. And so if I start this again, right now what it's doing is it's checking those 1,000 files. It's resumed, and if I pause it, we can see that we picked up with cell 164. And if we scroll up a little bit, well, it's probably too much to scroll up, but essentially we were able to, in a second or two, compare that everything is the same, and then just start right where we left off, moving those objects or files into the system. And if I want to see what those look like, I can once again do my HyperStore list S3 Illumina. I can see that I have a virtual directory called experiment 5529. Again, the actual file names were experiment data intensity base calls. This is just how Illumina sequencers actually name their files. So this is the original file. Here's what it saved it to as an object. And so if I want to actually see, a little bit more, like let's do all of the cells. I can just jump to that directory. And so I'll look in lane 1, and I can see that I've got a number of subdirectories, or again, when we're working with object storage, there's no real thing as a subdirectory. They're what we call prefixes. So with that, I'm hoping that you've learned how to set up and install the AWS CLI. You're able to check out our guide, set it up for Windows, Mac, and Linux, and you're going to be able to move files from your local file system into an on-prem cloud or the actual Amazon cloud. You're able to move them back, and you're able to script this, whether you have a MAM from media entertainment, or if you have a LIMS system in genomics, or if you're just a normal system admin and you've got backups that are storing on disk, and that could be your Oracle, your Oracle Linux, Armon. It could be your SQL Server from Microsoft backups, and the ability to copy them to a more durable, more cost-effective tier of storage. I know that a lot of what people fear about when they're using S3 is the complexity, and with this tool, the complexity just basically goes down to 0. So I'm going to look and see if there are any questions, and it looks like we're actually out of time. I have one question. The one question was, How did you set that up for Windows? Again, that's in the actual guide, but I can give you a quick sneak peek. I had to do two things. The first one was under my users in my, not download, sorry, in my documents, I created this file here, and what this file does, if I edit it, what it does is it sets up the alias but for Windows, and the aliasing in Windows is called DOS key, and I did the exact same thing. I created a command called HyperStore, and I referenced AWS, my profile Cloudian. Again, if you want to name it something else, that's perfectly fine. The URL or the IP address of my endpoint that I want to use S3, and then what this says here is accept any extra arguments that I place after that. To get that to work every time I open up CMD in Windows, you need to edit your registry. And so I created this quick little reg, but you could do this with regedit as well. And so you're in HKey current users, software Microsoft command processor. You're going to set auto run that anytime you open up the command, that it's going to go to my user directory documents, and it's going to run that command. And that's just simply how the equivalent of bash _ profile or bash RC for Windows. And to set this up for Windows, super simple. Download Python, takes about 30 seconds. Install Python, we've got it in the guide. You just need to check off that you want pathing enabled, and then you simply run pip install AWS CLI and then AWS config, and you're off and running. It's just as simple to do in Windows as it is Linux or Mac. And so really I don't want anybody to have any fear about, hey, this is a Linux only thing, I have to learn Linux. Whatever tool, whatever OS you like, it's going to work. And I think we're out of time. I hope you found this informative. If you did, please request, and we will do other topics. We can talk about rclone. We can do advanced commands for AWS CLI. The sky is the limit. So, write us, let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see next. I'm Doug Soltesz. Thank you very much.